In order to prune and to prune well, you need to know the bud types on fruit trees. There are two basic bud types, vegetative buds and fruit buds. A vegetative bud will grow either a leaf and or a branch that has leaves along it. A fruit bud will give rise to first a flower and then fruit if it gets pollinated. Let's look on this tree here and look first at the vegetative buds. So from my finger up to the extent of the branch, this section of branch contains only vegetative buds. This is one, this is one, this is one, this is one. Let's look at this one to visually describe it. It is pointed, it is slender, and it is clasped tight to the stem. Okay, now let's talk about fruit buds. Let me show you a few different manifestations of fruit buds. This is a fruit bud, this is a fruit bud, this is a fruit bud, and this is a lateral branch with a bunch of fruit buds. But let me describe first the visual nature of fruit buds. They are plump, they are fat, they are round, and they protrude out from the stem. Again, they could be right on the stem, at the end of a short shoot, or even better, at the end of a mid-size length lateral. Why this is good is because you have a number of fruit buds along this 6-inch run. Fruit bud, fruit bud, fruit bud, fruit bud. Okay, there's a little more involved in this, wouldn't you know it? And that is, where on the tree, on what age wood do the various fruit buds occur? And it's pretty basic. Vegetative buds, all the buds on 1-year-old shoots are only vegetative. If we look here, you can see this little pruning wound. This indicates that this branch was pruned here last winter. Why? Because we wanted it to grow. To make a branch grow, you head it back or cut it back, and you leave a little stub. So this branch grew from here to its tip last year, a good growth response. All the buds on 1-year-old wood are only vegetative buds. So you go looking for vegetative buds, look at 1-year-old wood. I might add that when the selection was made as per which bud to prune this to last year, we picked a bud that was under-facing or outward-facing, so that the growth of the branch would be up and out into the light, and in this instance with an open center tree, it keeps the center of the tree open to sunlight. So 1-year-old wood contains only vegetative buds, and then by looking at the nature of the wood, not just that it's apical or tip of the branch, but it's thinner, it's more bronzy, and more lively looking, I'm going to say. You see the pruning stub here? Everything down below this is 2-year-old and older wood. Let me characterize its nature. It's thicker, it's browner, grayer, older, and it has almost only fruit buds here. And so you look for vegetative buds primarily on 1-year-old wood and fruit buds on 2-year-old and older wood. I'm going to make a heading cut on this branch. Let's talk about heading cuts and their effect, and then let's execute one. You get 3 main responses for making a heading cut. Again, let's define it. A heading cut is any cut made into 1-year-old wood. The response is the branch will regrow. The more you cut the branch back, the stronger and longer the growth response will be. Let me point with my clippers here in that regard. Nice branch. If I leave it alone, it won't grow much. It'll set up fruit. If I prune it a little, let's stipulate about 25% of last year's growth, it'll grow maybe a foot. You get to the point of about 50% of last year's growth, and that becomes a very stimulating cut. If I cut here, it'll grow maybe 18 inches. If a branch is lagging, but it's healthy, it's just not growing a lot, and you really need a growth response from it, cut it back. Cut it back all the way to even one bud. And that should do the trick and probably catch it up, in this instance maybe grow 2+ feet like that. So that's the primary effect from making a heading cut. There are a couple of secondary, tertiary results, and then I'll make a heading cut. When you cut a branch back, i.e. headed, it thickens it and strengthens it, thus enabling it to bear the weight of the wood, the weight of the fruit, be self-supporting, mechanically strong. These are all good things. The third effect is that it induces the formation of fruit buds, both on the main stem, but even better, on short and intermediate laterals. Laterals, how important are they? Well, almost all species of fruit bear almost all their fruit on laterals, thus really important. Let's look at one here in terms of its manifestation and expression of fruit buds. This nice lateral, it's about 6-7 inches long, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 fruit buds, either fully formed or on the road to being fruit buds. Now you can't carry 4 or 5 fruits along this 6-7 inch stretch, but you can carry a couple. Having more fruit buds, which equals more flowers, gives you more pollen, which gives you a greater chance of good pollination and a good crop. So I've got a number of possibilities here, and I'll just let them roll. See which get pollinated and set fruit, and then I'll thin. Maybe carrying 2, 1 and 2 along this run. And that'll give me a couple big, fat, juicy, sweet apples. Now there's no qualitative difference in the fruit that's borne on a single fat fruit bud on the main stem or on a long, slender 6-inch shoot. However, you will have more fruit buds on a longer shoot. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4 expressed fruit buds on this stem. It's good. Let's now make a heading cut. And one of the things in a sense you could say with pruning, you only have to ask and answer one question, and you better get it right. And that is, do I want this branch to grow or not? If I want it to grow, I head it back. The more I want it to grow, the harder I head it back again into 1-year-old wood. So I'm going to ask and answer the question, do I want this branch to grow further? I do. I like another couple 3 feet of extension growth with a nice lateral framework behind the lead bud. So I'm going to prune it. I'm going to prune it about half its length. And here's a nice bud here to prune to. And in general, think of buds as pointers or directional arrows. The direction that the bud you cut to is pointing is the direction of regrowth. In general, you cut to either what is called an under-facing bud or an outward-facing bud. I want this growth to be up and out and into the light, keeping the interior of the tree in the light. And so I'm going to make a cut here. let's do that again. Let me steady the branch and make a cut. Okay, what did I do? Well, I headed it back. I headed it back quite a bit. I headed it to a bud facing in an outward direction. Could also be called an under-facing bud. And I left a little stub, 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, 1/2 inch, it don't matter. Leave a stub. The reasoning being that you tend to get a little dieback from pruning, especially in semi-arid climates like our Mediterranean climate here in Central Coast of California, but across the board. And you don't want that desiccation and dieback to kill the bud, so you leave a little stub. It's just a buffer between the environment and the item being your nice vegetative bud that will regrow here. You can also see I made a cut at about a 45-degree angle slanting away from the bud. And the reasoning for that is that when either irrigation rain or rain falls, the water sheds off and not into the bud. A lot of little tricks, and you could say, wow, what's the difference? Well, the difference can add up and be quite significant. So we find there's a lot of specificity in pruning. Here I have a branch. It's a fine branch with a nice lateral framework, but a branch I'd like a little more extension growth out of. So I'm going to head it again. The harder I cut it back into 1-year-old wood, the longer and stronger it will grow. Here's my thinking. Nice branch, but what if it were 2 or 3 feet longer with a really nice set of laterals that bore fruit? If I went up 2-3 more feet, I might get another 10 to 20% more fruit off this tree than now. So I'm simply going to head it, and head it quite a bit. I have a bud facing towards me. I'll just cut it to that. I expect length, strength, and lateral induction. Come back in a year's time and we'll see how we did. Let's look at shortening cuts. First, let's define terms. A shortening cut is where you cut back a branch into older wood, 2-year-old and older wood. And usually for practical purposes, it's into 2-year-old, maybe 3-year-old wood. I've got an example here where I'm going to make a shortening cut into 2-year-old wood. Let's look at some of the particulars and then explain the reasoning. Pruning stub from last January's, that would be January of 2020. It's now 2021. January 2020, heading cut, growth response. Everything lower down on the branch is 2-year-old wood. But what type of branch is this? It's actually a lateral branch. So what do you want from laterals? You want weak vigor, which is somewhat of an oxymoron, I know, but that's what you want. Fruit is born best on weak to moderate growing laterals, not strong ones. This is very strong. You like strength on your big wood, your main branches. You like weakness and flatness on your secondary laterals, i.e. your fruit-bearing branches. So I'm going to cut this. Another thing about long laterals. Over time, they bear fruit on their tips, and they tend to sag and or break. Sometimes I jokingly call them serious saggers. All joking aside, when a branch goes much below horizontal, it very quickly loses vigor, thus integrity. So I have developed a rationale, and I think quite sound one, for what I'm going to do here. I have a lateral that's overly long and vigorous, and I want to shorten it. That is, cut it into 2-year-old wood, which will effectively stop the further extension growth of that branch, semicolon, for the life of the tree. So you best be sure you want to do that, I'm sure. Looking down here, again, point of demarcation, 1-year-old wood, 2-year-old and older wood. I see a nice, weak, flat lateral. that already has 1, 2 fruit buds, not fully formed, but well along the way, very predictably would flower, get pollinated, and fruit next year. So I'm going to make a shortening cut to that. You could also call this a redirective cut. Let me make the cut. What we have here is a beautiful, actually exquisite, well-formed branch on an apple tree. It's long, it's strong, it has a marvelous lateral framework which will bear the fruit, and essentially we've done our job. I don't need to get any more extension growth out of it. So if you remember, you stimulate a branch to grow by heading it. If you don't want it to grow anymore, you could either leave it alone or cut it back slightly into older wood to an express fruit bud. Let me pull this branch down and look at another expression of where 1-year-old wood begins and then below it 2-year-old wood. If you look here, this is an example of a branch that was not pruned. What do I see? I don't see a pruning stub, but I see this concentric ringing, and that indicates above that 1-year-old wood, new growth, below that 2-year-old and older wood. So again, a branch that wasn't pruned, demarcation between old and new wood. I'm going to put this branch back up, and then I'm going to talk about shortening it. So I'm going to cut slightly into 2-year-old wood to an express fruit bud, like that. What is my expected response? I won't get any further extension growth because there isn't a vegetative bud there, and I have a whole bunch of different fruit buds that will, as it were, suck up the vigor, the juices, the sugars, the nutrients, the water, and grow good fruit. But this branch, it won't grow any further. So that's one way to treat an established branch. So let me just thin the unwanted branches so we can bring the picture into resolution a little more. So anything unwanted is simply removed at its base, at its point of origin here. And some of these are just perfectly fine branches. Some, like this one, not so much or not so much. It's just, you can't have too much of a good thing. And sometimes it's about the placement of the branch. For instance, if you look here, I'm going to thin this branch and keep that. Well, you might say, and you would be right, this is a stronger, longer branch. Yeah, but it's positioned just over that one. And one of the rules, as it were, is that you do not want a branch over a branch within a couple, 3 feet. So if I put that one on the ground, I have this one here, which is reasonable, not as good and robust as the other, but reasonable, and it's got better spacing like that. So let me get on with it and remove the rest.